The pulsing beat of the club thrummed through Nate's veins as he leaned back against the plush leather couch, a lazy smirk on his lips. The air was thick with sweat, expensive cologne, and the scent of desire, and he reveled in it. Bodies tangled together, hands wandered, and lips met in drunken abandon, all just the way he liked it. A warm mouth traced a slow path down his neck, teeth nipping playfully, and Nate exhaled a soft laugh. He was in his element, basking in the rush of pleasure, the freedom of being unbound, unclaimed. His omega nature meant nothing to him. He refused to be like the others who found their mates and settled into domestic bliss. That wasn't him. He was wild, untamed, and free. Until the moment that changed everything. It hit him out of nowhere, a sharp, electrifying pull that stole his breath. The mate bond. It seized his chest, his heartbeat erratic, his entire body stiffening beneath the stranger's touch. His stomach twisted violently, an overwhelming wave of nausea rising inside him. And then he saw him. Across the dimly lit club, standing near the entrance like a storm waiting to break, was Milo. The instant their eyes met, the world tilted, every sound in the club fading into a dull hum. Nate sucked in a sharp breath. No. No, no, no. This couldn't be happening. But Milo's expression told him otherwise. Pure, unfiltered devastation. The alpha's entire body was rigid, his sharp jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. The betrayal in his darkened gaze was suffocating, but worse than that was the pain that cracked through the bond, searing into Nate's soul like wildfire. Nate was still pinned beneath another man, his shirt open, his scent mixing with someone else's. And Milo had walked in on it. For the first time in his life, Nate felt shame. Milo didn't say a word. He didn't need to. With one last burning look, he turned on his heel and walked away. And just like that, Nate's world crumbled. The ache in Nate's chest refused to fade. It had been days since that night, and yet the mate bond still clawed at him, making it impossible to ignore. His body felt off, wrong. He had tried everything to shake it off, drinking, flirting, even letting others touch him the way he used to enjoy. But none of it worked. Every touch felt wrong. Every kiss tasted bitter. And it pissed him off. Nate wasn't supposed to feel this way. He wasn't supposed to need anyone. And yet, here he was, lingering outside a high-end lounge where he knew Milo would be. The moment he stepped inside, he spotted him. Milo sat at the bar, his broad shoulders tense, a glass of whiskey cradled in his hand. He looked cold, unreadable, but not unaffected. The alpha's fingers gripped the glass a little too tightly, his body a little too still. Nate smirked and sauntered toward him. If he wanted to act like nothing happened, fine. But Nate wasn't going to make this easy. Sliding onto the seat beside him, he leaned in just enough for his scent to reach Milo, letting it curl between them like an invitation. "Didn't take you for the brooding type," Nate murmured, his voice low and teasing. Milo didn't look at him. "Go away." Nate scared. "Now, that's not very nice. You haven't even let me apologize." At that, Milo turned to him, his gaze sharp like a knife pressing against Nate's throat. "Apologize." His voice was smooth, controlled, but beneath it was something dangerous. Nate's skin prickled. Damn. Why did that make his stomach twist in the best way? "I didn't know," Nate admitted, meeting his gaze head-on. "If I had, What?" Milo cut in, voice dark. "You wouldn't have done it?" Nate hesitated. Because the truth was, he wasn't sure. Milo exhaled sharply, setting his glass down with more force than necessary. Then, in one swift motion, he reached out and grabbed Nate's wrist, tugging him forward. The sudden proximity knocked the breath from Nate's lungs. Milo's scent was intoxicating, rich, dominant, and laced with something dangerous. His grip was firm but not painful, his touch burning against Nate's skin. For a moment, neither of them moved. The tension between them crackled like lightning in a storm, suffocating and addicting. Then Milo leaned in, his lips so close to Nate's ear that his breath sent a violent shiver down his spine. "Be careful, Nate," Milo murmured, voice a low growl. "You don't want to play games with me." Nate swallowed hard, his pulse racing. "Fuck. He might actually lose this game. Nate should have walked away. Instead, he wanted more. That one touch, that one whisper, it had left him restless, his skin itching with a need he didn't understand. And it only got worse. Everywhere he went, Milo was there, his presence suffocating yet addictive. Every look, every unspoken challenge, it was pulling Nate deeper into something he wasn't ready for. And the worst part? Milo wasn't doing anything. He was ignoring him. At a charity gala, Nate dressed in his most tempting attire. Tight, black silk, open at the collar, exuding pure confidence. But Milo barely glanced at him. It infuriated him. So he did the one thing he knew would get a reaction. He flirted with someone else. And then it happened. One moment, he was laughing in another alpha's ear. The next, Milo was there. Without a word, Milo grabbed Nate by the wrist and dragged him outside, into the darkened balcony. Nate barely had time to react before Milo pressed him against the stone railing, his body close, heat radiating between them. Nate's breath hitched. He had won. Jealous. Nate taunted. Milo's fingers ghosted over Nate's hip, slow, deliberate. "You're testing my patience," Milo murmured. Nate exhaled sharply as Milo's scent surrounded him. And then, Milo dipped his head lower, brushing his lips just over Nate's jaw. Not a kiss. Just torture. Nate shivered, his fingers clutching at Milo's jacket. And just when he thought Milo would finally give in, Milo stepped back, smirking. "Not tonight," Milo whispered, turning to leave. Nate was left breathless, trembling, and burning for more. This was war. Milo hadn't been prepared for the raw intensity of the bond that snapped into place when Nate entered the room. The air had changed. It wasn't just the heat, the heavy music, or the blinding lights. It was the sudden weight of Nate's presence, one that had always hovered just beneath Milo's skin. But tonight, it was different. Nate stood across the room, his posture rigid, eyes wide as they locked with Milo's. Milo felt an involuntary heat spread through his body, something more potent than the alcohol in his system. His breath hitched, an unfamiliar mix of guilt and desire curling inside him. Nate's gaze flicked down, and Milo's heart hammered painfully in his chest. His mate. Standing there, completely silent, yet conveying everything with the tension in his muscles and the way his lips pressed into a thin line. He hadn't seen it, Milo hoped he hadn't, but Milo knew. He'd never felt anything so raw before. Milo swallowed hard, his hand instinctively brushing against his thigh as if trying to ground himself. The smoothness of his own skin only heightened the burn in his body. He didn't know how to respond to Nate's presence, to the flood of emotions threatening to spill out. Nate took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving Milo's. The room felt smaller now, the sounds of the party faded into the background. There was no more music, no more distractions, just the undeniable pull between them. Nate's hand twitched by his side, but he didn't reach for Milo. He wasn't sure whether he could. Nate's voice was low, a soft whisper, but it carried a weight that made Milo's chest tighten. The word hung in the air between them. A word that held everything, every question, every feeling. Milo was frozen, staring at Nate's trembling hand, fighting the urge to reach out. There was a need there, deeper than anything he could explain, but it was tangled with confusion and fear. Nate's eyes softened for a moment, his posture shifting ever so slightly. He didn't speak again, but his silence was an invitation, a delicate, unspoken offer that Milo could either take or let slip away. Milo felt his breath hitch, his heartbeat thudding louder in his ears. His lips parted, but the words didn't come. Instead, he moved, closing the distance between them. His hand brushed against Nate's arm, just the lightest touch, but it sent a shock through both of them. Nate's body stiffened, his eyes darkening, and Milo saw the way his jaw clenched. Before they could say anything more, Nate stepped closer, his breath warm against Milo's neck. The touch was brief, just a passing moment that felt like an eternity. Milo's skin tingled where Nate's body brushed against him, his heart racing with a mix of longing and fear. What was happening? The bond between them had always felt abstract, something distant that he didn't want to acknowledge, but now, it was undeniable. The days after that night were filled with confusion and tension, neither Milo nor Nate able to break the silence that had settled between them. Milo tried to ignore it. He told himself it didn't matter. But every time he saw Nate, every glance, every fleeting touch, it was like the world shifted. It felt like something deep was calling to him, and no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, it refused to let go. One evening, Milo found himself outside, sitting on the balcony, staring out at the stars. The cool night air wrapped around him, a gentle breeze that did little to soothe the heat simmering beneath his skin. He heard footsteps approach, slow but purposeful. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Milo, Nate's voice broke the silence, a soft murmur in the dark. Milo exhaled deeply, his fingers curling around the railing in front of him. "You've been avoiding me." Nate hesitated, and for a moment, Milo thought he might walk away. But then there was a gentle pressure at his side, Nate's presence filling the space beside him. The quiet was thick, the air between them electric with unspoken words. "I don't know how to do this," Nate admitted, his voice low but clear. "You don't believe in the bond. And I don't want to force it on you, but I can't ignore it." Milo turned his head slightly, just enough to catch Nate's profile. He could feel the vulnerability in the air, but Milo didn't know how to respond. The tension between them had been building ever since that night, and now it was as if every movement carried the weight of something important. Something that neither of them was ready to face. Nate shifted closer, his arm brushing lightly against Milo's. The touch was so subtle, but it burned through Milo's skin, sending a ripple of warmth down his spine. Milo sucked in a breath, the pressure in his chest growing, as if he were suffocating on the feelings he couldn't voice. "I want to try, Nate," Milo whispered, his voice barely audible. "But I don't know how." There it was. The honesty they both needed but had been too afraid to say. A tentative promise that left both of them open to the possibility of something they didn't fully understand. Nate's hand slowly reached out, resting just near Milo's. It wasn't a touch that demanded anything. It was simply an offering. His fingers brushed against Milo's, soft, tentative, but the world seemed to stop as their skin connected. Milo's breath caught, his heart racing as the realization hit him. He wanted this. He wanted Nate, despite everything. The following week, Milo and Nate found themselves constantly circling each other, drawn together by an invisible force neither could fully comprehend. Their interactions were tense, charged with a raw energy that neither of them could explain. Every look, every touch was an invitation, but neither of them knew how to proceed without crossing a line they weren't ready to cross. One night, they found themselves alone at a quiet bar. The atmosphere was intimate, dimly lit, with soft music playing in the background. The moment they sat across from each other, the world outside seemed to fade away. It was just them, their unspoken thoughts hanging in the air between them like a delicate thread. Milo studied Nate for a moment, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of his glass. The vulnerability in Nate's eyes, the way his shoulders were slightly hunched as if bracing himself it was impossible to ignore. Milo wanted to reach out, to comfort him, but there was still that hesitation, that fear that lingered between them. "You never told me what you were thinking that night," Milo said quietly, his voice carrying a gentle curiosity. "When you saw me with someone else." Nate's gaze softened, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something deep within his eyes, something raw and unguarded. He leaned forward slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I hated it. Seeing you with someone else. It shattered me. I couldn't stand the thought of you not being mine." The admission hung in the air, and Milo's heart clenched. There was a truth to it that struck him deep. Despite the walls they'd built between them, there was a part of him that felt the same way. Slowly, as if testing the waters, Nate reached across the table, his fingers brushing lightly over Milo's. The touch was tentative, almost uncertain, but it spoke volumes. Milo's pulse quickened, and his body moved on its own, the warmth of Nate's hand sending a shiver through him. Milo didn't pull away. Instead, he allowed the touch, his own fingers curling gently around Nate's. The electricity between them crackled, but it was tender now, a slow-burn connection that was only beginning to blossom. The moonlight spilled into the room, casting a silver glow across the floor. Milo sat at the edge of the bed, hands clenched tightly in his lap, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts. The space between him and Nate had never felt more charged, more fragile, and yet every part of him was drawn to bridge that gap. Nate, across from him, was still. His eyes studied Milo, but there was no judgment in them, only a quiet understanding that seemed to peel away the layers of resistance Milo had built up. The air was thick with silence, and the weight of everything unspoken hung in the room. Milo's heart hammered against his ribcage as Nate took a step forward. His movements were slow, measured, but there was something tender in the way he approached. It wasn't the aggressiveness of someone who demanded attention. It was the quiet kind of confidence that came from knowing exactly what he wanted. And in this moment, what he wanted seemed to be Milo. When Nate reached out, his hand hovered for a brief moment, an unspoken question lingering in the air. Milo met his gaze, and for a second, neither of them moved. Their eyes locked, and in that instant, something shifted. The tension between them was no longer just about the attraction. It was about trust, about vulnerability. Milo's breath hitched as Nate's hand gently brushed his cheek. The touch was soft, barely there, but it sent a rush of heat through his body, leaving him breathless. It was the kind of touch that spoke of affection, of intimacy not just physical but emotional. It was something that Milo had never allowed himself to experience, and now, with Nate, it felt like the world had tilted just a little bit on its axis. Nate's thumb traced the line of Milo's jaw, his touch lingering in places that made Milo's pulse quicken. It wasn't the kind of touch that rushed, that forced something to happen. It was deliberate and slow, as if Nate was savoring every second of their connection. Milo closed his eyes, allowing himself to lean into the touch. The warmth of Nate's hand felt like an anchor, grounding him in a moment that felt fragile yet perfect. His lips parted slightly as he exhaled, his body shifting ever so slightly toward Nate, a silent invitation. Nate's hand slid from his cheek to the back of his neck, the pressure just enough to pull him closer. Their foreheads touched, the proximity dizzying, but neither of them pulled away. It felt natural, like a magnet that couldn't resist pulling them together. "Are you sure?" Nate's voice was a low whisper, his breath warm against Milo's skin. Milo opened his eyes, staring into Nate's, and saw the uncertainty there. Nate wasn't trying to rush him. He wasn't forcing anything. Instead, he was giving him space to choose, to decide. That realization struck Milo like a thunderclap. He wasn't used to being given the choice. He had always lived on the edge, running from everything, especially vulnerability. But in this moment, with Nate, there was no fear. No hesitation. Just a deep need to trust, to let go. Milo nodded, barely able to form words, his voice betraying the depth of the emotions churning inside him. I want this." And with that, it was as if the world exhaled. Nate's lips met his then, soft and slow, the kiss gentle at first but building with every second. Milo's hands instinctively found their way to Nate's chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath the fabric of his shirt. It was a reassurance, a reminder that they were both here, in this moment, together. The kiss deepened, becoming more intense, but still slow, as if they were savoring each new step they took together. Every touch, every movement was charged with meaning. There was no rush, no hurry, just the promise of something real. Milo's fingers brushed over Nate's collarbone, the contact light but enough to make him shiver. He could feel the heat of Nate's body, the strong pulse of his heartbeat beneath his skin, and for the first time, he allowed himself to accept it, to accept Nate. They pulled away just enough to catch their breath, their foreheads still touching, their breaths mingling in the stillness of the room. Milo felt vulnerable, exposed, but in the best way. There was no need for walls anymore. Nate was here, and he wasn't going anywhere. "Don't pull away," Nate whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Milo nodded again, the weight of those words settling deep within him. He wasn't going to pull away. Not anymore. Their lips met again, this time with more urgency, a fire that had been smoldering beneath the surface for too long. It wasn't about the rush of passion, it was about connection. The need to understand each other, to find their way through the maze of emotions they had been building for so long. Their kiss became more heated, their bodies pressing closer as if they couldn't stand the space between them any longer. Milo's hands roamed across Nate's back, feeling the muscles beneath his skin, the heat radiating off him. He wasn't sure when it happened, But somehow, the vulnerability he had once feared was gone, replaced by something far deeper: trust. As they pulled away again, their breaths coming faster now, they shared a look that said more than words ever could. They had crossed a line, but it wasn't about physical boundaries anymore. It was about the emotional bridge they had built between them. And it was only just beginning. The morning light streamed through the window, casting a soft glow on the room. Milo lay there, still tangled in the sheets, his body warm, but his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. His heart raced with a strange mix of contentment and confusion. The events of the night before had left him feeling something he hadn't felt in years, perhaps never before, a deep sense of connection. Nate was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, his back to Milo, staring out the window as though lost in thought. His presence was calming, yet there was an intensity to him that didn't go unnoticed. Milo watched him quietly for a moment, taking in the way the light hit his profile, the curve of his shoulders, and the faint scar along his jaw. He was beautiful in a way that made Milo's chest tighten with something close to awe. Milo's fingers brushed over the smooth surface of the sheet next to him, his hand lingering in the emptiness Nate had left behind. He wanted to say something, but the words were tangled up, buried under the weight of the vulnerability that still made him hesitate. Nate's voice broke the silence, low and quiet, yet full of an unspoken understanding. "You're still here." Milo shifted, his gaze following Nate's every movement as he turned his head, their eyes locking. There was no need for clarification. They both knew what Nate meant. Milo had stayed, and it was more than just physical proximity. He had stayed emotionally, in a way that scared him but also felt right. "I haven't gone anywhere," Milo responded softly, his voice unsteady but honest. The words felt foreign, but they were true. Nate turned fully toward him now, his gaze softening as he looked at Milo. He didn't say anything at first, just studied him, as though trying to read every emotion flickering across his face. It was both intense and gentle, and it made Milo's heart stutter in his chest. "I don't know how this works," Nate admitted, the vulnerability in his voice making Milo's stomach flutter. "I don't know how we get past the things that came before us." Milo sat up slowly, drawing his legs in close to his chest, wrapping his arms around his knees. His gaze never left Nate. "Neither do I." The honesty between them was disarming, but Milo couldn't help the way his heart swelled at Nate's willingness to show his own uncertainty. It made him feel less alone in a world that had always been overwhelming. There was a silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of quiet understanding, a shared weight that they were both trying to navigate together. Milo swallowed, unsure of how to voice what he was feeling, but he knew he had to say something. "I've spent so much of my life pretending I didn't need anyone," Milo began, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I think I need you. I never wanted to need anyone before." Nate's expression softened, his eyes softening with something that resembled relief. He reached out, his hand gently cupping Milo's cheek. The contact was tender, and Milo leaned into it, closing his eyes for a brief moment, letting the warmth of Nate's touch ground him. "You're not alone anymore," Nate murmured. "Not if you don't want to be." Milo opened his eyes, looking into Nate's, and for the first time, he didn't feel that familiar urge to run. The fear of rejection, of being hurt, had dulled to a quiet hum in the background. For the first time in a long while, he felt safe. And maybe it was okay to let himself feel that way. Milo reached out, his hand gently taking Nate's, pulling it closer until their fingers were intertwined. It was a simple touch, but it meant everything. It felt like a promise, a beginning. "I don't know what happens next," Milo said, his voice still uncertain but determined. "But I'm willing to find out. With you." Nate's smile was soft, genuine. "I'm willing to." For a moment, everything in the world seemed to settle, as though all the chaos that had come before them faded away. All that was left was the quiet understanding that they were both in this together. Nate pulled him closer, his hand resting on the back of Milo's neck, the touch gentle but firm. Milo's breath hitched as Nate's lips hovered just above his, their foreheads touching. "Are you ready for this?" Nate asked, his voice hushed, almost reverent. Milo nodded, his lips curling into a faint smile. "I think I'm as ready as I'll ever be." Nate's lips met his then, soft and slow, with a tenderness that made Milo's heart skip. The kiss was full of promise, full of something unspoken but deep. There was no rush, no frenzy, just the slow, steady rhythm of two people learning to trust each other, to give something real. Milo's hands rested on Nate's chest, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath the fabric of his shirt. He traced the line of Nate's collarbone, the touch lingering as his fingers explored the strong, comforting presence of Nate's body. Each movement was an exploration, a conversation without words, full of the emotions that had been building between them. As the kiss deepened, Milo felt the heat rising between them. But this time, it wasn't just physical. It was emotional, a deepening bond that was both tender and intense. There were no promises of perfection, but there was a mutual understanding, a quiet agreement to navigate the complexities of their connection, one step at a time. Their bodies pressed closer, but there was no urgency, only a shared moment of stillness. As the kiss broke, Nate's forehead rested against Milo's, and for a moment, neither of them moved. There was no need to. They both knew that the connection they were building wasn't defined by what happened next. It was defined by the moments they shared, the trust they placed in each other. The days that followed were filled with a strange new rhythm, one that neither Milo nor Nate could quite define but both felt settling in their lives. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, a quiet bond that had been woven between shared glances, gentle touches, and honest conversations. Milo couldn't help but feel the weight of everything he had avoided for so long. The fear of getting close to someone, of letting someone in, had always kept him distant. But Nate was different. There was something in the way Nate looked at him, not with judgment, but with acceptance, like he understood exactly who Milo was and didn't want him to change. It was an unsettling feeling, one that made Milo question everything he thought he knew about himself. It was a quiet evening, the kind of evening that Milo had always loved, peaceful and unassuming. He was sitting on the couch, legs stretched out in front of him, his mind wandering. Nate was across the room, staring at his phone, but Milo could feel his presence in the air, like an invisible pull drawing him in. Milo shifted uncomfortably, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. There was a conversation that needed to happen, one that had been on his mind for days. The problem was, he wasn't sure he was ready for it. Not yet. But Nate must have sensed it too, because after a few moments, he set his phone down and walked over, sitting next to Milo on the couch. The warmth of his body next to Milo's was enough to make his heart skip, but it also grounded him. This was real. They were real. Milo, Nate's voice was calm, low, as though he was trying to gauge the right words. You've been quiet the past few days. Is everything okay? Milo swallowed, feeling the weight of the question settle in his chest. His first instinct was to dismiss it, to tell Nate that everything was fine. But the truth was, nothing felt fine. Not when the questions swirling in his mind were louder than anything else. I don't know, Milo admitted, his voice unsteady. I'm not used to this. To feeling like this. Nate turned to him fully now, his gaze steady, open. Feeling like what? Milo hesitated, struggling to find the words. It wasn't that he didn't want to explain, it was just that he hadn't figured it out for himself yet. Vulnerable, Milo finally said, the word tasting strange on his tongue. I've spent so long convincing myself I didn't need anyone, and now. Now. Nate prompted gently, his hand brushing against Milo's, a small but significant touch. Milo looked at their hands, the way they fit together so easily, as though they had always been meant to. Now, it's like I don't know what to do with myself. With you. Nate's expression softened, and he leaned in just a little, his face close enough that Milo could feel the heat from his skin. It's okay to not know. It's okay to take your time. But Milo wasn't so sure. Every part of him screamed that he wasn't supposed to need anyone. That he wasn't supposed to want someone as badly as he wanted Nate. And yet, here he was, his heart exposed, and it terrified him. I'm scared, Milo confessed, his voice small. Scared of being hurt. Scared of what happens when I let myself feel too much. Nate's hand gently cupped Milo's face, his thumb brushing over the line of his jaw. I'm not going anywhere, Milo. I promise. The sincerity in Nate's voice broke through the walls Milo had spent so long building around himself. It wasn't just the words, it was the warmth of his touch, the quiet confidence in his presence. Milo had never experienced anything like it. For a moment, the world outside seemed to disappear, leaving just the two of them in the quiet of the room. Milo's breath caught as he leaned into Nate's touch, feeling the heat of his hand against his skin. It was a simple thing, but it felt like a promise. A promise that they could work through this together. Nate's other hand moved, gently brushing through Milo's hair, his fingers caressing the soft strands. It was a movement so tender, so intimate, that it made Milo's chest tighten with a mix of longing and uncertainty. "I don't know how to be the person you need me to be," Milo said quietly, the words coming out before he could stop them. "I don't know if I can change." Nate's lips pressed to his forehead in a soft kiss. "You don't have to change, Milo. You just have to let me in. That's all." Milo's eyes closed at the touch, at the kindness in Nate's voice. He wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this wasn't just some fleeting moment. But deep down, there was still a part of him that feared the inevitable heartbreak that always came when he allowed himself to care too much. But then, Nate's lips were on his, slow and gentle, as though testing the waters, as though waiting for Milo to make the first move. And Milo did, leaning into the kiss, his hand finding Nate's arm, gripping it tightly as if to anchor himself to this moment. The kiss deepened, but it wasn't hurried or desperate. It was a slow exploration, a quiet promise. Nate's hands moved to Milo's shoulders, pulling him just a little closer, and Milo responded, his body aligning with Nate's as if they had always fit together this way. The kiss was filled with unspoken things, the fear, the uncertainty, the hope. It was as if they were both trying to convey everything they couldn't say aloud, wrapping their feelings into the press of their lips, the gentle caress of their hands. When they pulled away, breathless, Milo's forehead rested against Nate's. "I think I'm starting to understand," Milo whispered, his voice hoarse. Nate smiled softly, brushing a lock of hair from Milo's face. "You don't have to understand everything right now. We have time." Milo's heart pounded in his chest, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from the warmth of something he had never allowed himself to feel before, hope. The days following their conversation on the couch were a whirlwind of emotions for both Milo and Nate. They were tentative with each other, but it wasn't an awkward silence. It was the kind of quiet that spoke volumes. There was a certain comfort in simply being around one another, even if the future seemed uncertain. Milo spent more time at Nate's apartment, and the more they were together, the more Milo realized how much he had been hiding from himself. The walls he had built around his heart began to crack, though he still wasn't sure how much he was willing to let fall. The weight of their connection was impossible to ignore now, the pull between them undeniable. Nate's presence was a constant, a steadying force that made everything Milo had known about himself feel like it was shifting, evolving. But Milo was still scared. The fear of being vulnerable, of being hurt, lingered in the back of his mind. He didn't want to get too close, didn't want to give in too easily. The possibility of heartache was real, and he wasn't sure he was ready for that. Nate, for his part, seemed to sense Milo's hesitation. He didn't push. Instead, he allowed Milo to navigate his own emotions, his own doubts. He was patient, giving Milo the space he needed but never pulling away completely. Every day, there was something new. Another shared laugh, a stolen moment of closeness, another piece of the puzzle that was their budding relationship. It was a rainy evening when the change happened, the kind of rain that fell softly against the windows, making everything feel quieter, more intimate. Milo had arrived early, as he often did now, and Nate was finishing up some work in the kitchen. Milo sat on the couch, his legs curled beneath him, his thoughts drifting. It had been a few days since their last conversation, and while the words had been difficult to say, things had begun to feel more settled between them. No more games, no more pretending. They were both aware of the tension that lingered, but neither of them had taken the next step. Milo's gaze drifted to the kitchen, where Nate moved gracefully, his back to him as he puttered around. The soft hum of the music in the background, the way the light from the kitchen illuminated Nate's figure, made Milo's chest tighten in a way he hadn't expected. There was something about this moment, about being here with Nate, that made him feel at home. Before he could overthink it, Milo got up and walked toward the kitchen, his steps slow but purposeful. He stopped just behind Nate, unsure of what he was doing, but not really caring either. His heart was pounding in his chest, and for once, he didn't want to push the feeling away. He just wanted to see where it would lead. "Hey," Milo said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Nate turned, surprised, but his expression softened when he saw Milo standing there, his posture slightly tense but open. "Hey," Nate replied, his voice just as soft. "Everything okay?" Milo nodded, but the words didn't come easily. Instead, he reached out, tentatively, almost unsure of his own movements. His hand brushed against Nate's arm, a small, almost hesitant gesture, but it felt right. Nate's eyes flicked down to Milo's hand, then back to his face. There was something unspoken in the air, a moment of realization that they were both feeling the same pull. "You don't have to do this if you're not ready," Nate said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Milo met his gaze, his breath catching in his throat. There was a vulnerability in Nate's eyes, one that mirrored his own. For a brief moment, Milo wondered how it had gotten this far, how they had become so important to each other in such a short amount of time. It was more than physical attraction. It was something deeper, something raw, something real. But it was also terrifying. "I think I'm ready," Milo said, his voice low but steady. The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, everything felt still. Nate's gaze softened, and before either of them could say anything more, Milo stepped forward, closing the gap between them. His hand found Nate's, their fingers intertwining naturally. Without saying anything else, Milo leaned in. The kiss was slow at first, tentative, as if testing the waters. But the more their lips met, the deeper it became, the more urgent, the more real. Milo's heart raced, his pulse quickening as the kiss deepened, and he felt Nate's hands on his waist, pulling him closer. There was no rush, no urgency this time. It was just them, exploring this new territory together, taking it one step at a time. Milo's hands moved up to Nate's shoulders, his fingers brushing the fabric of his shirt, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath. It was a simple touch, but it meant everything. It meant trust. It meant connection. When they finally pulled away, breathless and slightly dizzy, Milo couldn't help but smile. "This is new," he said softly, his voice still shaky. Nate smiled back, his thumb gently brushing over the back of Milo's hand. "We'll figure it out," he replied, his voice filled with warmth and understanding. And for the first time in a long while, Milo believed him. There was no need to rush. No need to have all the answers. They were just two people, figuring things out together. As the rain continued to fall outside, they stood there in the kitchen, holding each other, knowing that this was just the beginning. The days that followed were filled with quiet tension, though it wasn't the kind of tension that pulled them apart. Rather, it was the kind that pushed them toward each other, making each touch, each glance, feel more significant. Milo found himself learning new things about Nate every day. Little quirks, subtle habits, the way he smiled when he was lost in thought, or how he always reached for Milo's hand when they sat together. It was the kind of intimacy that didn't require words, just a quiet, shared understanding. But beneath the growing warmth between them, Milo's doubts still lingered like a shadow, always present, always just out of sight. It wasn't that he didn't want to be with Nate, he did, more than anything. But there were parts of him that still felt like they didn't belong in this world. He wasn't the type to settle down, to trust someone fully. He had built walls around himself for so long that it was hard to imagine them coming down, even for Nate. One afternoon, as they sat in a small park near Nate's apartment, Milo could feel the weight of his own thoughts pulling him away from the peaceful moment. He watched as Nate talked about a project he was working on at his job, his eyes lighting up with passion as he spoke. It was easy to get lost in Nate's enthusiasm, but it was also easy for Milo to feel like an outsider. His own life, his own dreams, seemed so different from Nate's, so disconnected. "You look lost," Nate said, his voice soft as he placed a hand gently on Milo's arm. "What's going on in that head of yours?" Milo blinked, surprised that Nate had noticed. He hadn't meant to be so obvious. "I'm fine," he said quickly, his gaze dropping to his hands. He didn't want to burden Nate with his doubts, his insecurities. Not when Nate seemed so certain of everything. Nate didn't let it go, though. He tilted his head, studying Milo's face, and then gave him a soft, knowing smile. "Milo, you can't hide from me forever," he said, his voice teasing but filled with affection. "I know something's bothering you." Milo looked up, his heart pounding in his chest. It wasn't that he didn't want to share with Nate, it was just that he didn't know how. He had spent so much of his life keeping things inside, burying his emotions under layers of indifference, that the thought of opening up felt like stepping into an unknown world. "I'm just—" Milo started, his voice faltering. "I don't know if I'm cut out for this. For us. I'm not like you, Nate. You've got it all together. You've got a job, a future, and I'm just— I don't know. I don't want to mess this up, but I'm scared. Scared that I'll end up pulling away, or that I'm not what you need." Nate's expression softened, his hand never leaving Milo's arm. "Milo," he said gently, "you don't have to have everything figured out. I'm not asking you to be perfect, and I don't expect you to change who you are. I just want you to be you. I want to be with you, flaws and all." Milo felt a lump form in his throat, his chest tightening with emotions he couldn't quite name. The vulnerability in Nate's voice, the way he spoke with such certainty and care, it was more than Milo had ever allowed himself to believe he deserved. "I don't know how to do this," Milo whispered, his voice barely audible. "You don't have to know," Nate replied, his voice steady. "You just have to take it one step at a time. And I'll be right here, every step of the way." It was then that Milo felt it, the shift. The walls he had spent so long building, the defenses that had kept him safe, were slowly starting to crumble. He didn't know if he was ready to let them fall completely, but the idea of trying, of being open with Nate, felt a little less impossible than it had before. Without thinking, Milo reached for Nate's hand, his fingers brushing against Nate's in a gesture that was both tentative and powerful. It was a small move, but it felt like a breakthrough. Nate's fingers intertwined with his, a silent promise that they were in this together. "You're right," Milo said softly, his voice tinged with uncertainty but also something more, a quiet hope. "One step at a time." Nate smiled, his eyes warm as he squeezed Milo's hand gently. "That's all I'm asking for." For the rest of the afternoon, they walked together, not speaking much but simply enjoying the quiet companionship. There was a calmness between them now, a sense of understanding that hadn't been there before. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't without its challenges, but it was real. And for the first time in a long while, Milo allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, it could work. The days continued to pass, and although their connection was deepening, there was still a lingering undercurrent of tension. Milo couldn't ignore the way his heart raced when Nate was close, the electric charge between them that seemed to make everything feel more intense. It wasn't just the physical attraction anymore, it was something else, something deeper. It was the way Nate looked at him when he didn't think Milo was paying attention, the way his smile made Milo feel like he was the only one in the world. There was a weight in those moments, a promise of something more, but it was wrapped in the uncertainty of what that more really meant. Milo's world, for all its complexity and chaos, had always been simple when it came to relationships. Keep it light, keep it easy, never get too attached. But with Nate, everything felt different. The boundaries that Milo had so carefully constructed in his life were beginning to blur, and it both thrilled and terrified him. The night was the same as many others, just the two of them curled up on the couch at Nate's apartment, a movie playing in the background but neither of them really watching it. Milo's head rested on Nate's shoulder, the steady rhythm of Nate's breathing soothing in the quiet room. But tonight, something felt different. "Milo!" Nate's voice broke through the silence, low and steady. Milo shifted slightly, meeting Nate's gaze. He hadn't said much in the last hour, and the intensity in his eyes now sent a flicker of unease through Milo's chest. "Yeah," Milo replied, his voice hushed. Nate hesitated, his fingers gently brushing against the side of Milo's face. "I think we need to talk about what happens next," he said softly, his thumb tracing small circles over Milo's skin. Milo's stomach tightened, a knot forming as the weight of Nate's words sank in. He knew this conversation was coming. It had been inevitable, but it didn't make it any easier. The thought of discussing the future, of what they were to each other and what they wanted, felt too real, too raw. "What do you mean?" Milo asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though it betrayed his nervousness. Nate leaned forward, his lips brushing against Milo's forehead in a tender kiss. "I mean that this thing between us, it's not just a passing fling anymore, is it? It's more than that." He met Milo's gaze, his eyes dark with emotion. "And I need to know, are you ready for that? Are you ready for more than just the fun, the chaos?" Milo's heart skipped a beat, and he took a moment to gather his thoughts. His gaze dropped to their intertwined hands, fingers still linked but with an unspoken distance between them. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to tell Nate that he was ready for this, for them. But the words caught in his throat. "I don't know if I'm ready for more," Milo confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've never really been in a real relationship before. I've never done this." He motioned between them with his free hand. "I don't know how to give you what you need." Nate's face softened, and he gently cupped Milo's chin, guiding his face back toward him. "Milo," he said quietly, "I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm not asking for anything more than what you can give. I just need you to be honest with me, to be real with me." Milo swallowed hard, the tightness in his chest only growing. "What if I can't do that? What if I screw this up?" Nate shook his head, his fingers tender against Milo's jaw. "Then we work through it. Together." His voice was a soft promise, and it wrapped around Milo like a warm blanket, comforting and safe. Milo's heart beat a little faster at the sincerity in Nate's voice. The depth of the emotion Nate was offering him, the raw honesty, it was overwhelming, but it was also exactly what Milo had been avoiding for so long. Nate was asking him to trust, to step out of his comfort zone, and Milo knew he had to decide whether he could take that leap. "I want to be with you," Milo said suddenly, surprising both of them. The words felt like a release, like something had finally clicked into place. He was scared, yes, but the thought of walking away from this, away from Nate, was scarier. "I don't know what it looks like, but I want to try. I want us to figure it out." Nate's smile was small but genuine, his eyes lighting up with relief and something deeper, something that made Milo's chest ache. "That's all I need, Milo. We'll figure it out. One step at a time, just like we've been doing." Milo nodded, feeling the knot in his chest loosen just a little. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he might have a chance at something real. And then, without warning, Nate leaned in, closing the distance between them, his lips meeting Milo's in a slow, gentle kiss. It wasn't urgent or frantic. It was everything that they weren't saying, the trust, the fear, the hope, all rolled into one soft, lingering kiss. When they pulled away, breathless, Nate whispered, "One step at a time." Milo smiled, the weight in his chest finally feeling lighter. He didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. Together with Nate. The days that followed were quieter, but there was an undeniable shift between them. Milo could feel it in the way Nate's touch lingered a little longer, the way their conversations seemed to be filled with more unsaid things than ever before. There was a soft tension in the air, a feeling that they were inching closer to something neither of them fully understood yet. Milo had always been a free spirit, never one to commit to anything for too long. The idea of opening up, of letting someone into his life in a way that went beyond casual or temporary, felt like a weight pressing against his chest. But with Nate, it was different. Every time Nate looked at him with those sincere, patient eyes, Milo felt like he was on the verge of understanding what it meant to really be seen, really be known. One afternoon, they found themselves in the park, the air crisp with the fading warmth of summer. They had been walking for hours, not talking much, just enjoying the silence. The world around them seemed to fade as they walked side by side, their hands occasionally brushing but never quite holding. Milo couldn't help but notice the way Nate seemed to move around him, always careful, always mindful. It was in the small moments like this that Milo began to understand the depth of what they had. It wasn't the grand gestures or the sweeping declarations. It was the little things, the way Nate always made sure Milo had his coat when it got cold, the way he'd listen when Milo talked, even when the words came out jumbled or incomplete. It was how he made Milo feel like he mattered, like he was worth the effort. Eventually, they stopped by a bench, sitting down under the shade of a large oak tree. Milo felt the familiar warmth of Nate beside him, the subtle yet comforting presence that had begun to feel like home. He stole a glance at Nate, who was looking out into the distance, a slight smile on his face. "Hey," Milo said, his voice softer than usual. "You've been quiet." Nate turned to him, raising an eyebrow. "Have I?" "Yeah," Milo replied, looking down at his hands. "What's going on? You've been so different lately." Nate's gaze softened, and for a moment, Milo wondered if he was going to be honest with him. "I don't know," Nate said after a pause. "I guess I've been thinking a lot. About us. About everything." Milo's heart raced, the familiar nervousness creeping up. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Nate started, hesitating as if searching for the right words, "I've been thinking about what comes next. What we're doing. How we fit into each other's lives. I know we're not there yet, but I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose you." The honesty in Nate's voice struck Milo hard, his chest tightening. "Nate," he whispered, looking into Nate's eyes, "I'm not good at this. I don't know how to be what you want." Nate reached out, his fingers gently cupping Milo's cheek. "I'm not asking you to be anything you're not. I want us to keep figuring this out, together. If you'll have me." Milo let out a shaky breath, the emotions swirling inside him threatening to overwhelm him. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he didn't feel afraid to face it. Not with Nate by his side. "I'll have you," Milo finally said, his voice steady, though his heart was racing. He leaned forward, their lips meeting in a soft, lingering kiss. It wasn't urgent or passionate, but it held everything they had yet to say, the promise of more, the trust that they would navigate this together, no matter where it led. The days following their conversation were filled with more moments of connection. Milo and Nate spent their time exploring the small things, taking walks, having deep conversations, and even finding comfort in each other's silence. But it wasn't just the quiet moments that made their bond feel real. It was the way they opened up to each other, sharing parts of themselves that they had kept hidden for so long. For Milo, it was a revelation. He had never been someone who found it easy to trust, let alone let someone in. But with Nate, it felt different. It was as if Nate's presence had slowly begun to heal the parts of him that had always been closed off, the parts that had been afraid of getting hurt. And as much as it terrified him, Milo found himself wanting more. More of Nate's care, more of his warmth, more of the connection they were building. One evening, after a quiet dinner at Nate's apartment, the two of them sat on the couch together. Milo felt a sense of peace settle over him, the comfortable silence between them no longer feeling heavy but full of unspoken understanding. Nate reached for Milo's hand, his thumb brushing over Milo's knuckles in a gentle caress. "You know," Nate said softly, "I don't think I've ever met someone like you before." Milo looked up, meeting Nate's gaze. "What do you mean?" "You're different," Nate continued, his voice low and thoughtful. "You've got this whole thing going on where you don't let anyone get too close, but then you let me in. You trust me with things you've never told anyone." Milo hesitated, looking down at their hands. "It's hard," he admitted. "But with you, it doesn't feel so scary." Nate squeezed his hand gently. "Good. Because I'm not going anywhere. Not unless you want me to." Milo swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing on him. "I don't want you to go," he whispered, barely audible. Nate smiled softly, his eyes filled with warmth and understanding. "I'm right here, Milo. And I'm not going anywhere." The space between them had always felt vast, but in that moment, it shrank. Milo leaned in, their foreheads resting together as they shared a quiet, intimate moment. There was no need for words, no need for grand declarations. In the simplicity of their closeness, Milo found everything he had been searching for. And with that quiet promise, Milo knew that this was just the beginning of something new, a beginning they would face together.